Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating 2002 Advas Center report to really unpack how massive government efforts to integrate Ethiopian immigrants into Israeli society yielded some deeply surprising and, frankly, completely unintended outcomes. You know, when a government sets out to absorb tens of thousands of new citizens, the policies drawn up in quiet boardrooms don't always match the messy reality on the streets. Today, we are going to explore exactly how and why that happens.
But right off the bat, before we map out our journey, we've got to ask this central, incredibly provocative question. Because as we'll see, the data reveals a stark contrast between what policymakers intended and what actually went down. We're looking at a wild situation where immense financial generosity and really carefully crafted policies inadvertently resulted in geographic concentration and economic marginalization. Here is how we're going to break this all down today. First, the Ethiopian immigration waves. 2, housing, expectation versus reality. 3, the special mortgage paradox. 4, employment and vocational training. And finally, number 5, labor market outcomes. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the Ethiopian immigration waves, and understanding this massive influx. We are talking about two major, highly distinct waves of arrival here. First, you have Operation Moses in 1984, which brought in 8,000 immigrants. Then, Operation Solomon in 1991, bringing an additional 14,000. These were massive logistical feats, and they basically set the stage for two very different policy approaches by the Israeli government, policies which the Advas Center set out to rigorously evaluate in 2002. To put the sheer scale into perspective, by the time of this 2002 report, the total population of Jews of Ethiopian extraction in Israel had reached about 85,000, and that includes folks born in the country. This created a massive, urgent integration challenge. The government had to figure out housing, employment, and education for a rapidly growing demographic. I mean, literally almost overnight. Moving right along to Section 2, housing, expectation versus reality, often referred to as the policy of dispersion. So, on paper, the government explicitly wanted a policy of dispersion. The goal was to prevent ghettos and actively steer immigrants toward middle-class neighborhoods. They even instituted these strict rules limiting exactly how many Ethiopian households could be in a single building or a single neighborhood. But the undeniable reality on the ground was drastically different. The immigrants ultimately ended up heavily concentrated in disadvantaged, low-income neighborhoods across just a really small number of cities. So how exactly did that happen? Well, early on, immigrants were placed into temporary absorption centers. Now, instead of direct absorption, where immigrants are essentially handed resources and left to make their own choices, which is actually what they did for immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopian immigrants experienced what's called mediated absorption. As anthropologist Esther Herzog points out so perfectly here, this system inadvertently fostered a really restrictive relationship. The institutions basically treated absorption as a social problem to be managed, and that ultimately created dependency on the system and totally hindered organic, independent integration into wider Israeli society. The data really reveals the long-term result of those early missteps, leading to severe demographic concentration. Despite all those strict official dispersion policies we just talked about, by 1999, thousands of Ethiopian Israelis were heavily concentrated in just a handful of localities. The dispersion policy essentially completely fractured under the weight of systemic realities. Okay, that brings us to Section 3, the special mortgage paradox. This is an incredible case study in when sheer generosity backfires. Picture this. To get immigrants out of temporary mobile homes, a move that was actually sparked by a hunger march organized by the immigrants themselves, the government rolled out the special mortgage program. And honestly, on paper, it was unbelievably generous. We're talking mortgages up to $110,000. And get this, 80% of that loan converted into a pure grant after 15 years. The result? Well, it successfully made the vast majority of these immigrants homeowners. But here is the paradox. Local brokers and sellers in poor neighborhoods realized exactly how much government grant money these folks had in their pockets. So they immediately and artificially inflated the prices of cheap tenements to perfectly match the government grants. So yes, the immigrants became homeowners, but they drastically overpaid for depreciating assets in slums. The sheer scale of the state funding behind this was absolutely massive. Billions of shekels. Billions were allocated between 1994 and 2000. It was a monumental transfer of wealth. But ironically, because of that artificial price inflation we just discussed, this immense budget largely enriched the previous owners. They sold their slum apartments at hugely inflated prices, which allowed them to upgrade to middle-class neighborhoods, while the Ethiopian immigrants were left holding the keys to the socio-economic periphery. Let's shift gears now to Section 4, employment and vocational training, and how folks navigated a highly polarized labor market. The really crucial point to understand here is that policymakers were absolutely terrified that Ethiopian immigrants would sink straight to the bottom of the wage scale. So in 1985, for the Operation Moses Wave, they implemented a very lengthy, intensive, multi-year process with prolonged vocational training. But fast forward to 1991 with Operation Solomon, and they hit the brakes. They completely reversed course. They decided the long training wasn't working and instead pushed for immediate labor market entry, drastically shortening the transitional phases. 2 different waves, 2 entirely opposing strategies. So you're probably wondering, how did these 2 opposing strategies actually play out? Which brings us nicely to Section 5, labor market outcomes. Let's actually look at the data behind these policy shifts. The overall outcomes were honestly pretty challenging. When you look at the prime working age group, 25 to 54, the wider Israeli population had a labor force participation rate of 76%. But for Ethiopian Israelis, despite all those varied training initiatives and policies, that rate remained stubbornly low at just 53%. Now, a major factor here was a notably low participation rate among Ethiopian women, but even so, across the board, the gap was highly significant. But wait, here is the ultimate data-driven irony of this entire policy experiment. The 1980s immigrants, the ones who endured those supposedly flawed, lengthy, and somewhat culturally patronizing training programs, actually ended up with a significantly higher labor participation rate of 60%. Meanwhile, the 1990s arrivals, who were given the new and improved policy of being rushed directly into the market, had a participation rate of only 44%. The data literally flipped the government's entire set of assumptions right on its head. So, we have to conclude by asking this absolute critical question. Because while the first generation was made into homeowners, they were essentially locked into depreciating, overpriced housing on the geographic and economic periphery. And now, their children, the second generation, are reaching adulthood. But because they aren't technically new immigrants, they don't get access to those massive special housing grants, and they don't exactly have wealthy parents to help them buy into the middle class. The true success or failure of these massive billion-shekel government interventions won't just be judged by the data of 1999, but by what happens to this next generation. Will they remain stuck in the periphery, or will they break through? It's a massive, complex question this report leaves us grappling with. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.